So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be loved. Love means understanding redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be loved by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be loved by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be loved and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be loved and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be loved and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be loved and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
The future belongs to those who show up, to those who come together and continue the good work of building the beloved community. Over the past few years, we've witnessed an awakening, one filled with shock and anger, alongside fear, pain, and exhaustion. We've seen bold claims and commitments, and new voices stepping up. Change is happening, but with change comes resistance. Ushering in a new way of living, one free from racial division, requires rigorous persistence, nonviolent persistence, a love-centered way of thinking, acting, speaking, and engaging that leads to individual and societal transformation. What better way to build the beloved community than by bringing people together over food and conversation? In partnership with Inclusive, formerly known as Civic Dinners, the King Center is inviting you to host a beloved community dinner and continue the work of bridging the racial divide. Are you in? Here's how to get involved. Sign up to host a beloved community dinner. You'll receive the host guide with the 3 big questions. You can invite your neighbors, peers, colleagues, family, and friends to join. And you can host at your home or at your favorite restaurant or online. Simply follow the host guide for an amazing conversation and experience the power of community. You'll walk away feeling refueled and inspired with new ideas, connections, and resources. In times of isolation and exhaustion, simply coming together in community can make all the difference. Together we can build the beloved community. Join us.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Tara Gay, and I normally am the assistant producer for Beloved Community Talks, and I have usually the task of being behind screen, but tonight I have the honor and the pleasure of being able to host this very important conversation as we really take the time to examine the impact of violence, gun violence, the trauma and the anxiety that faces so many of our children and families, especially as we prepare for so much of our nation to start sending their children back to schools. So tonight we wanted to be able to have a conversation to really be able to explore not only the impact on the mental health of our children, but also be able to provide you all with some tools and hopefully some guidance on how you're able to engage with your children around conversations that may need to be had to encourage them to be able to think about their mental health and be able to acknowledge the things that they may need in order for you to support them in that way. We also want to invite you all this evening to tell us where you're coming in and watching from, share where you're tuning in from with us this evening. And as you just saw, we also want this evening to serve as a guide for how you can actually begin to have and host these kinds of conversations in your own home with those who you know, perhaps an opportunity to get to know those who you don't have close connections with as well. But really, as we think about building this beloved community, the conversations that we need to have must start happening, and we invite you all to join us in continuing these conversations. At this time, I'd actually like to invite to join me as well Dr. Bernice A. King, who is the CEO for the King Center, because we certainly want to recognize her and her work and with this conversation, but also being able to examine some of her own experiences around gun violence and how it has shaped and the things that she has dealt with her own mental health and wellness, rebounding from some of those experiences. So at this time, if we can have Dr. King come on. Good evening, Dr. King. Pleasure to have you here.
Good evening, Tara. Thank you. Glad to always be here on this platform.
Yes. So, Dr. King, as a way of just kind of setting some context for people this evening, I wanted to just kind of provide some numbers for people to consider, because I think when we think about violence and gun violence, a lot of people have associated simply with school shootings. And I say simply not to minimize it in any way, but certainly that is the way in which they are thinking about it. But what we recognize is that gun violence certainly is outside of just school environments and certainly impacting our children in astronomical ways. And so for those who are not familiar, Sandy Hook in December of 2012 is when we saw the violence impacting children who were elementary school students. That was after Columbine, which happened in 1999. And they actually started a Sandy Hook promise that many schools this year, as they return, may actually have their staff take that promise about how we think about the safety of our children and the considerations around gun violence. And so some of these numbers are from their nonprofit to be able to share with people. But each day that there are 12 children who are killed from gun violence. And I'll say that again, every day, 12 children are killed as a result of gun violence, and another 32 are the ones who suffer injuries. Guns are the leading cause of death for American teens, the leading cause. Firearm deaths are more than 5 times higher than those children being able to drown or possibly drowning in America. Since 1970, there have been 2,032 school shootings, and 948 of them have occurred since 1999. After 2012, after Sandy Hook. And then we also know since 1999 that over 300,000 students have actually been in schools when school shootings have occurred. So we certainly have an understanding of the urgency of this conversation, Dr. King. But before we move into that place, I think it is important for those who may not have heard your story before or may not be as familiar with your journey with gun violence and how it has impacted your family. Can you just share with our audience this evening the age you were when you had gun violence interrupt your family and what you all understood and the impact that it had on your mental health and wellness as you navigated from that?
Yes, thank you for asking that question, because I think it is important for people to know why this subject matter is so critical to me. I was 5 years old when my father was assassinated. It certainly disrupted our household. And in my case, or in our case, with my mother being a part of the movement that he led, her life changed because she had to now figure out what she was going to do next. That happens in many households where the primary breadwinner is taken or leaves or dies by other means. But in this case, the trauma and the tragedy, how do you explain to a 5-year-old, especially in 1968, that your father is no longer with us, and the why and the how? She didn't know how to do that, honestly. She did her very best at my age, trying to think of age appropriate things to say and do. For instance, I had asked her, because she told me he was going home to live. He was going to live with God, and he's a spirit now. So I happened to ask her, well, what is a spirit? That was a question later, not in that moment, because I probably started processing all of this. And this was after we left the cemetery. So after the entombment took place. And she looked at her sister who was in the car with her, trying to figure out what I'd say. And she just decided to hug me, and say, Mommy loves you, because she felt that maybe that could communicate a message to me. And then she proceeded to get us some initial counseling, got some psychiatrists actually, to check on us. And they seemed to think we were, okay. And I love my mom. Everybody knows I love my mom. But one of the things that I will say, it is very important that children not only be checked on initially, but a process continue. It did not happen in our case. And as a result, I was kind of left in my own world of thoughts, and developed a whole lot of raw emotions through time. And then by the time I was 11, my grandmother got shot in church, unheard of back then. And I had to process again this violent death in our family. So I had a lot of issues. I had issues of fear. When my father was assassinated, my mother would leave the home and don't go, because I felt like something was going to happen to her. She kept coming back, of course, so that helped. Then, and I'm going to be transparent about this, I had bedwetting problems, beyond the age that I should have been doing that, as a result of living with these fears. I used to look at pictures in my family, especially after my grandmother was killed. I was 11 then, so 5, my father, 11, my grandmother. I used to look at pictures, because even after my father was killed by gun violence, by an assassin, a year and a half later, my uncle was found in his pool. He did not drown. It was this mysterious death. And so 6 for my uncle, 11 for my grandmother, who was my father's mother. And so I used to look at pictures thinking death was after our family. So I lived in constant fear of somebody was going to be taken away from us, that we were not safe as a family. And I would try to figure out, who was going to be next by looking at pictures and say, okay, this person was first, this person was second, and counting. It was just crazy preoccupations. And so, dealing with all of this, and a host of other things, I had a lot of anger, and the real issue of abandonment, that, to this day is still an issue, but not at the level as it was when I was younger. But the things that really helped me ultimately is I did have to get some counseling to process through all of this. And my spirituality, being called into the ministry and ultimately going into ministry, and having to, deal with the word of God constantly and letting it minister to me, having friends around, processing it in conversations. And so if I would say anything, and why this conversation is important tonight, there's no right or wrong way. What is wrong is if we don't touch our kids, if we don't connect with them, if we just kind of leave them, to their own thinking. And fortunately, when I was growing up, a lot of this wasn't happening. But imagine if it was, what could have happened to me mentally. I could have just been totally crazy. I went through some phases where I had, rage and everything, because it does a lot to you when your life is violated that way. When someone just decides to disrupt, sometimes it's accidental. But guns, and I'm afraid to this day. I'm physically afraid of guns. I don't like being around them. I remember we had an event during the 50th anniversary of my father's, commemorating my father's assassination. And we had someone that was converting guns to tools or I can't remember, shovels. And they wanted me to carry it. I was terrified. It's crazy. But a lot of that just comes from what guns represented to me as a child. And so it took a lot for me to get to a place where I could say, but it was well into adulthood. So I would just say again, talking to our children, not one time, but having a process. You know, I know everybody can't afford counseling. It's unfortunate. It's something that we really need to consider in society today, with as much that's taken place, all of the trauma that kids are facing. We need it. So, you know, that's my story. And, you know, I hope tonight will provide an opportunity for parents to start that process if they haven't, to be encouraged if they are doing it. And again, I can't emphasize enough, don't stop. Because, you know, the moment that these things happen is one thing, but other things are happening, building upon it, you know. And so there really needs to be some proactive approaches, because let's be real, Uvalde, Buffalo, all of the other, it's not the last time. I wish it was. And so instead of waiting, let's think about, and let's talk to Dr. Perry and Dr. Tart about what can we proactively do preventatively for our children in such a traumatic culture.
Well, before we bring them on, I just would like to add and have you maybe illuminate just a bit for our audience as well, was why was it important for the King Center, based on the work that you are continuing to do around nonviolence and the promotion of that. How do you feel that we have an opportunity to give our children a different way of seeing themselves, being able to navigate the world when it is so violent, and how that work and that legacy, you're continuing to be able to do that? So why this conversation in itself was important for the King Center to be able to host.
Yeah, you know, a lot of people think nonviolence is about a social justice movement. You know, it's the protesting, it's the demonstrating, it's the making your voice be heard. Those are elements. The reality is nonviolence is a holistic approach for engaging life, engaging relationships, engaging conflict, engaging injustice, and creating, more importantly, an atmosphere and a culture where people can really be their best selves and have opportunities to fulfill those things that God places in their heart, and be treated with a manner of dignity and respect, and a culture that's free from, you know, violence and poverty and all of that. And so this conversation is important in that regard, because, you know, there's some tools that we have, I believe, at the King Center that can help people through our training. We have an online training that I want to invite people to sign up for at the King Institute, the KingCenterInstitute.org, or you can find it at thekingcenter.org. It's about a 17, 18-hour self-paced experience for you to understand holistically nonviolence as a way of life, as a way of thinking, as a way of engaging, as a way of acting, and a way of speaking that brings personal, cultural, and societal transformation. And so nonviolence can help us begin to cut off these chains of violence, you know, that you know, because we have this conversation so often, you know, first of all, we have the Second Amendment, people's right to bear arms. That's not going anywhere, at least not anytime in my lifetime. So that's a fact of reality. Guns are going to be here. They're here. There's nothing we can do about it. But what we can do is that we can develop and educate and train people to lead nonviolent lives, so guns are no longer needed or feel like people feel like they need them, so that guns no longer are the go-to. But the go-to is my nonviolent lifestyle, my nonviolent thinking, my nonviolent strategy. And so that's why it's also important to have this conversation tonight. And in a real way, having the conversations with our kids is a nonviolent approach too, because we are introducing to them, you know, ways that they also can be a part of this, creating this new environment that we so desperately need in our nation and world.
Yes. And the final thing I would just say, you alluded to it earlier about the way in which your mom was trying to comfort you based on what she believed you had the capacity to understand at that point. And I know in previous conversations, we have had conversations around this idea of a consciousness of care that we issue or kind of usher to our children, where we're trying to balance truth of what they need to know with what we understand their spirits and their minds and their hearts have the capacity to process. And so it is something that I think will be important. And I am definitely looking forward to having our guests be able to talk to us about that, because you also talked about how sometimes when children don't have the articulation around what they are mentally dealing with, it manifests in other ways. And you talked about bedwetting. So perhaps even being able to provide some ways for families to look out for some of these things, educators to look out for what are some of the signs of some of the changes that may be happening to children as well, based on their mental capacities to process some of the things that they have been dealing with. So at this time, Dr. King, I thank you so much for us setting kind of the context for tonight, because I do think it's in critical importance that we are able to allow people to understand why now, why this conversation, why the King Center, and what are really the opportunities we have to collectively make a difference, having nonviolence as a guide for us to be able to do that. So at this time, I certainly want to be able to invite our guests to help us be able to have further conversation around this as well. And so our first guest tonight is Dr. Alderwin Tart, who is a psychologist, minister, a speaker, media host, and author who serves as a frequent psychology expert for CNN and HLN. He has a YouTube channel that has more than 1.5 total million views, and he manages a thriving psychology practice here in Georgia. Our other guest is Dr. Steve Perry, who is also a leader, speaker, author, and an advocate that had the belief that it starts that those who can do better actually should. And so certainly tonight, we're hoping that he will give us guidance on how do we do that? How those of us who can do better, how should we be doing that? He is also the one who applied that principle about doing better by starting the Capital Preparatory Schools that have extended from Hartford, Connecticut into New York, and really has been able to successfully move students who are coming from largely economically divested communities and have 100% graduation rate since he started his schools in 2005. So at this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Perry and Dr. Tart to this conversation as well.
Thank you so much, sister, for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. And so one of the things I wanted to jump into and thinking about, certainly we talked about the role of parents. When parents are practitioners and how they navigate that journey for themselves when they also are ones who are caring for other people's children, while at the same time having to render that same care for their children and noticing the things that may be emerging for their own children and their mental health. I often use my youngest nephew, who just turned 16. He will tell me often, I don't want you to give me the Miss Gay response. I want you to give me the auntie response, because for a number of years, he actually was a student in the school that I actually taught in. So I know that usually means I need you to take off the hat of the thing that you do as a practice. And I need you to remember we are a family. And so I wanted to first invite both of you all to just explore, how do you do that? Certainly as a doctor and looking at mental health, Dr. Tart, how do you support and navigate that with your children, but at the same time rendering the same love and care to other people's children through this, the traumas that they have experienced related to violence?
Man, it's not easy. It's not easy. I'll tell you what I did. I have 3 children. All right. So I have a daughter who's 16, a younger daughter who's 6, and a son who's 7 months old. So y'all pray for me. Right. So, so what I did for my oldest daughter, this is my actual office. I actually invite her into this office and check in with her so that I can keep the psychologist hat on as far as an active listener. Because I found when I went home, too many lectures, too many directives, and it was because I was tired. All right. And her school is right across the street from my school. So one of the things that I do with her is I check in to see how she is doing. And I make sure that I'm constantly building up that relationship. And Dr. Perry's children, older than mine, but men told me you had better start gearing leaning towards the friendship piece, the relationship building as they get older. Otherwise, they start to diverge away. So, you have to find that right balance. And so the message I want to send to parents is that we have to see our kids' emotions. Like how we were parented, how our grandparents parent our parents, it does not work today. Our kids need to be seen and heard, and we have to see their emotions. We can't say, what do you have an attitude for? We can't say, fix your face. We can't say, if I wanted your opinion, I'd give it to you. Now, that doesn't work because the statistics are startling. Just last year, 44% of kids reported feeling sad or hopeless. That was last year. 37% of high school students reported poor mental health. And here's the whopper. 55% of students reported feeling emotionally abused by their parents with put downs, insults, and strong lectures. So we have to change the dialogue. We have to change our approach to really talking to our kids about how they feel and what's going on in their world, and then we can connect.
And Dr. Perry, for you.
I think, well, let me begin by saying thank you to Dr. King and the King Center. But more importantly, thank you, Dr. King, as a sister. It is easy to get caught up in the flowing speeches of your father, to look at his heroics as if he wasn't a man, a husband, a father, and if you were not a daughter who was without their father. It is so easy for the rest of us to miss that. And I never want that to happen. I want people to join me in thanking you and your family for what you have done, not just for Black people, not just for Georgia, not just for America, but for the world writ large, where you have committed your family to making us better people and the continents upon which we reside better places. So this conversation is consistent with your brand, as the young people say, of making the world a better place. And one of the things that you spoke of, Dr. King, was murder. And on a much more global scale, it's easy for us to take a look at the 24-hour news loop where they focus on the salacious. They focus on mass murders as opposed to murdering the masses. See, in urban centers, we deal with a death industrial complex where there is a murder experience, murder of your spirit or your actual body. That there's a way in which we talk to and about children. I'll kill your ass, you say to your 4-year-old who has taken his sticky hands and put them on your new dress. And I'll beat your ass if you say that to me again. I'll F you up, we say to our 11-year-old. There's a murder of the spirit. There's a violent language that we speak with. And we tend to think in our communities, especially the poorer communities, that's both Black and white, by the way, but we really got it deep in the Black community. There's a notion that nonviolence is acceptance. Like if you don't threaten to fight somebody, then you are accepting getting your behind whooped. If you are unwilling to threaten or put your hands on someone, that you are somehow capitulating to their will. And what we have to do is we have to acknowledge that we, many of us, in our rage, have not acknowledged our inability to speak effectively emotionally. We don't train our children or expect our adults to be able to communicate beyond rage. Either I'm angry or I'm mad. Not I'm hurt, not I'm disappointed, not I'm sad, not I'm confused, but that I'm angry. Because for us, rage is just a step away from action, which is violence, which feeds into the mass murder of the spirit. So practically speaking, somebody who runs urban schools, I don't necessarily feel the threat of a mass murder in my schools. I say, you understand what I mean. The threat is on the way to and from
Yeah.
school.
Mm-hmm.
It's from the mother who says that she would come down and fight me because I called her saying that her son didn't wear his tie to school today and he has a detention. The willingness of our community to escalate to a level of violence speaks to a level of mental illness that we have yet to begin to deconstruct. That we think that it is okay for a pregnant and a mother already, to come to a school to fight somebody else's child because her child says something about hers on the internet. We have become unhinged in such a grotesque way that the guns only make it fait accompli. So what we have to do is we have to call it out for what it is. We have to say what we see, not to absorb it as if it's part of our culture. Well, you know how Black people are. Actually, I don't, because I know a lot of Black people who really don't want to get in a fight. In fact, when I talk to those very same children in our schools, I take one girl over there and the other one, they're both in the same office. Did you say anything about her? I ain't saying about her. Do you say about her? And there's nothing in between them. Well, go ahead and do something then if you want to do it. They don't want to fight. They have just been trained that is the only method of protection of their spirit, which is being mass murdered every single moment. And we have to teach them to communicate that pain in ways that are not violent.
What Dr. Perry and Dr. King, and thank you, Dr. King, thank you for the etiquette lesson, Dr. Perry, Dr. King, and setting this up and talking about that. What we're talking about is generational PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not the gun violence. It's what we call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, right? So we're talking about going home and getting screamed at and yelled at and physical discipline and violence and gang violence. That's going on, and our kids are still coming to school, not to mention what's going on the internet. I'm going to read it's 10 ACEs, but there's another one they missed out. All right, there's 10 ACEs. These are called adverse childhood experiences. And what this is doing is it's traumatizing our kids' nervous systems. And what we're seeing is parents who went through this is traumatizing their nervous system. So just a quick psychoeducation. So there's the sympathetic nervous system. That's the flight or fight, right? That's what Dr. Perry is talking about, right? Little thing makes you activate, right? Well, what calms that down is the parasympathetic nervous system that actually relaxes you, right? And so if we're talking about this trauma, it affects our nervous systems, what we see, damaged nervous. So here are the 10 ACEs, all right? And 1 in 6 adults have at least 4 of these. Right? That doesn't even include the African-American community. 1 in 6, right? Childhood physical abuse, child sexual abuse, child emotional abuse. What Dr. Perry was talking about is emotional abuse. I'll beat your tail. I'll do this. I'll do that. I take you out. You know, hey, I don't care what you do. I don't care if you die. You die. Get your phone back, right? Physical neglect, having a mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal person living in the home. Having a drug addicted or alcoholic family member, witnessing domestic violence against a mother. Another one I'll add is witnessing domestic violence in the community. I mean, violence in the community in general. Loss of a parent due to death or abandonment. And then 10, incarceration of a family member for a crime. As we're adding those 10 things up, there are adults that are striking off the list, right? And so we're talking about multi-generational of adverse childhood experiences, ACE school, right? all those things lead to the problems that are occurring in our community. 10 to 12 times greater use for drug use if you have 4 more ACEs. 2 to 3 times more likely to have heart disease and cancer. It's that nervous system. It's that cortisol, constant cortisol in that body. 32 more times likely to have behavioral problems, right? And 8 out of the 10 leading causes of death correlate with exposure to 4 more ACEs. That's what we're seeing. And if we're not getting enough treatment, if we're not getting extended treatment like Dr. King, not just one time, but working with, we know these kids and adults are going through trauma, right? And we're not getting them the help that they need. This is how it's being transferred. And we can do something about that.
One of the things that we also, how many times have I been on a college campus and heard a sister say, I want an intelligent hoodlum. I need somebody who's going to protect me. What, first of all, intelligent hoodlum, is that an oxymoron? Is that like a jumbo shrimp? What are you talking about? And you want somebody to protect you from what? From who? Where are you going that you are at such and such a college that violence is still so frontal for you? It's because we've even trained our best and brightest that they have to be ready to fight at any given time. The burden that many Black men carry, that we literally got to be prepared to fight well beyond our time when we should be putting our hands on anybody for anything other than to give somebody a hug, grandkid a hug. We have to acknowledge that there are parts of our community that do really buoy these behaviors such that we actually, from the birth to the grave, we say that, you see a little boy, lift him up and shake him. He's a little boy, he's a baby. That don't do that. Even so much as when a child is born, I'm in my oldest son's apartment. We moved him in today. He's in college. And so that's why it sounds the way it does. But even when a child is born, pulling the father away from the child almost at birth, all these loving mothers are around there. Let me take him. Oh, you don't know how to do this. You don't know how to do that. Making us think, well, so I don't know how to love. So I'm not good at loving. Like, I don't know how. It's a diaper. Like, it really does. It's just the two things on the side. Pop it on. It is what it is. It's got the same stuff in there for the mother that it does for the father. All the way through what we do, and we see the impact of this. It's one of the reasons why you see very few Black men who work in schools, in elementary school. It is why when you see Black men engaging, typically, young people, is through a sport or through some sort of you could go to jail or Yale situation, some scared straight. We don't allow even Black men to communicate beyond our emotion because that makes many women feel uncomfortable. And then we wonder why brothers are so violent. Well, the currency that we trade in when we're talking to Black men is how tough is he? Nobody want to punk for a man. Okay, well, I guess we have to train ourselves as adults. Now, we talk so much about children to catch ourselves when we're hearing and saying and pushing out these cues about what it is to be a man. Because right now, the most violent people in our schools are girls. Man, right now, if you want to see a fight, just type in girl fight. And you will see for days some of the most violent, and I mean violent, because they don't feel safe. They don't feel like they can go to their softer side in so many spaces. We have to acknowledge it when we hear ourselves saying these things. You gonna let her talk to you like that? I would never let her talk to me like that. All you doing is putting a battery in that young woman's back, and then what's she gonna do when she gets there? But act in the language that she's been taught to speak. For many of us, our first language is violence. Our first language. So many of us grow to be very old, still with that accent of violence. We have to acknowledge that violence is around us in so many ways. It's not just what we watch on television. It's the way in which we communicate, quite frankly, with the people that we love most.
So
Can I bring something up, Tara? I know I don't want to take you off your,
no, go ahead.
train of thought, but just to kind of to sum this up after listening to both of them, I'm thinking about my father's quote that he used in the context of trying to help this nation understand why the cities were erupting in riots. Not to justify it, but explain where all of this energy comes from, this expression. And he talked about riots being the language of the unheard. As I translate that tonight, these violent things that are coming out of our kids, they're not being this. What are we not hearing with them? Even as we think about those families that Dr. Perry talked about, where kids are hearing violent things in the context of their homes, the sensitivity that all of us, whether we have children or not, have to bring to this is to understand that our kids are facing trauma holistically. Some are getting it within the home, some are getting it after they leave the home in the streets, and some in the home and as they leave the home. And then, of course, they get it, at school, wherever. And so our responsibility is to begin to try to tune in and hear what's going on with our kids. That's why we wanted to have this discussion, about are we talking not to them in a sense, we use that phrase, but really, are we talking with them? More importantly, are we having a conversation where we're listening? Because that's what Dr. Tart, talked about, is the power of listening. Because we have not been listening. They've been speaking a lot through their actions, their behaviors, and it's not all something's wrong with them. Maybe there's something wrong with us. First,
Well, that's
of
what
all,
I would say.
certainly
And
know
so
there's something in society, but yeah,
Dr. King, that's what I would say, Dr. King. I agree with Dr. Tart that we want to listen to the children, but I'm saying we have to listen to ourselves in our own homes. We have to listen to the way at the cookout somebody's talking to that child. Like we have to intervene. We have to intervene. When I'll beat you, okay. What did he do? What did he do? I'm sick and tired of him. You sick and tired of him? He's 8. Like, you got a long ride with this one. He ain't going nowhere. I mean, we have to work to make sure that the parents in our community develop a more affectionate tone. That they change, that we change the way that we speak to our children. If you teach your child Spanish, and you only put them in a Spanish-speaking household, they will speak Spanish, they will think in Spanish, they will act as a Spanish person. But if you teach them English, they will learn and think and act in an English way. If you teach them to be thoughtful with their words and compassionate with their conversation, then they will be compelled to do that. If you teach them to be violent with their words and violent with their conversation, then they will do that. And then what happens is they go to school and act violently. And then the school calls you and say, your child acted violently. And you come to the school and you do one or two things. I'm going to beat your ass for being violent. I'm going to beat your ass for telling me that he's being violent.
Violence all the way around.
None do we own that. You know what?
Yeah.
How many times have parents sat in my office? I don't know who the F taught you to talk like that. I'm gonna wager a guess here. I'm gonna give it a shot. I'm gonna go out on a limb on this one. I'm saying, Dr. King, yes, we definitely have to make sure that we provide the long-term counseling for our children. There's no doubt about that. But you did acknowledge that one of our biggest challenges is providing that in a large scale. Quite frankly, there are very few Black people that Black people can go to get counseling if we're going to have a real honest conversation about it. I'm saying, in the most pedestrian context, we as adults have to manage the way we speak to our children and one another, and then start to rewrite the language in our community so it is not so violent. One of the reasons why you don't hear children speaking is because they know that if they speak, somebody's going to threaten to hurt them. Because If they make themselves vulnerable, then they think that they're weak. So it's best to say nothing. And then they make very dangerous decisions.
I would say that for me, the greatest gift that both of my parents gave to me was allowing me to see that they were human beings, to allow me to see that they could experience loss and pain and sometimes fear, and still in the midst of all that experience love and joy. And I think that is one of the things we also have to unlock and be able to support our families in developing that muscle for their families and for their children, that they exist as human beings as well. Because my father stands 6'8". So at 5 years old, he was the biggest and greatest thing. He still is a great person to me, but just from a stature standpoint, what he could have represented versus what he actually represented to 3 girls that he had was phenomenal in shaping how we also had expectations for how we should be loved in the context of male relationships, other female relationships when it came to my mom. So I do think that part of this journey for us, as well as a community and beyond, is also the retooling of our families and how they have to unlock. And I think, Dr. Perry, you talked about, we cannot do, and Dr. Tart, you even mentioned it as well, cannot do the things that we have had generationally taught to us, because they have not released us from the trauma that came from those same steps and those actions. So just wanted to be able to hear from you all in time just about that. What is the importance of our parents showing up as human beings who can still thrive in the midst of all of these things that are happening that could otherwise be traumatizing?
I'll make a very quick point. So I mentioned earlier that my youngest son is going to be at Morehouse in 6-7 days. And today, one of my colleagues, a brother, Morehouse, man, said, "Doc, man, I don't want you to get all emotional when you go down there." I don't think that we hear that. I don't think that we hear that. So he's on some level daring me not to get emotional about my youngest son being 1,500 miles away. And so it takes a lot in me to be confident in myself as a man to say, I'm going to get emotional.
Right.
How about that? I am so going to be emotional. It's just about how emotional I get, because that's what I get to do. But I don't think that, and he wasn't, just to be clear, he wasn't trying to be mean. It's just he as a man is saying to me as a man, "Oh man, you better not don't show emotions." I want my sons to understand that I love them to the moon and back. I am crazy for them. I love them. And I don't want them to think that I'm going to withhold my emotions so that I can put on some facade. For who? For people who I don't care about?
Right.
I want the kids who I love to know that I love them. And I use that as an example that happened today. That we don't hear sometimes, even in our jokes, which they ain't really jokes, that we're telling each other, don't openly, overtly be vulnerable. Don't say those things, because if you do, I don't know, people gonna think something about you.
What we're talking about is the construct of warmth. What we know is that the amount of affection that kids, especially boys, get at 3 to 4 years old, so the kissing, the hugging, especially by a dad, leads to higher test scores in school. Why? Because the kid feels warm. They feel loved, which means they feel more confident. They feel competent. So if we're looking for an emotion to be on the lookout for, is when men feel incompetent. Look out. There are problems. A man who's incompetent is going to struggle across the board. A boy, when you ask him, what do you want to be? What are you good at? What do you do well, rather? And they say, nothing. That's a problem. Okay. That warmth allows you to be able to love that young man through indecision. And for girls is disconnection. Right. So we're looking at the health of girls and women is how connected are they to other people, especially other girlfriends. Right. So if we're talking about our kids as parents, as men, like Dr. Perry says, part of our job, our primary job, is to communicate and show warmth and love, not just discipline, not just bring home the bacon, not you gonna respect me. It's, do your kids, does your daughter, does your son feel you? There's a study that shows if you hug someone for 6 seconds, it produces oxytocin. If we talk about that parasympathetic nervous system, and you see this with rat studies, when they lick their young, they're able to decrease the cortisol levels. When we hug and kiss our sons and daughters, I don't care if they're going to college, I don't care how old they are, they feel that. And feeling that warmth allows kids to feel seen and allows them to experience warmth and love. So Dr. Perry sent out, is set the standard, but we have to look at it and say, as parents, how comfortable are we being affectionate with our children at
That's the
15,
point.
16? You had a rough day, do you hug them? Quickly, there was a mom who pulled up to a driveway, and her daughter was laying down having an anxiety attack. And it was raining, and she got out, and she laid down with her daughter and grabbed her hand. And after about 2 minutes, the daughter got up and they went inside. And the daughter's anxiety attack had subsided. That's what our kids need. Just be in the rain with me. Just hold my hand. Just ask me what's going on. But it's really easy for us to pull up and think about what it looks like to the neighbors. All right. Here you go outside in the rain, catching the cold. Here you are with all these emotions. Anxiety is not real. Depression is not real. Right. And so if we meet our kids, we see the emotion, not just the physical body. What's going on inside their head and hearts? When we do that as parents, we're going to have our kids' anxiety and depression decrease simply because they're letting it out to someone who's safe.
So Dr.
I'll
Tar,
say
when you
this,
say that, I think about the conversation I watch you having with one of your beautiful daughters related to school shootings. And you asked her, how did she feel about it? And she said numb. And it was startling to me because what I find is when I also talk to young people and this idea around whether they have witnessed from the news school shootings, whether they have experienced and have been in them, this idea that they have been able to emotionally turn themselves off and say they are numb. What is that indicating for us that we should be understanding? What is that an articulation of around their mental health and the lack of wellness mentally for them, that they have come to a place that, again, when we talked about statistically, over 300,000 of them haven't been in school buildings when shootings took place. How are we going to tap into our children who do not even believe they have feelings around these things that are absolutely unacceptable for them to have to be living through in terms of this violence?
It's a defense mechanism. You can't hurt a feeling I refuse to have. How many men do you see? I'm just going to let you have it. And they shut down. Right. And so with kids, they realize, all right, so I'm going to go numb. All right. So if I'm numb and I numb my feelings, and this is the danger, we start talking about Black men and suicide, boys and suicide. When you go numb, all right, you numb your feelings. They're not gone. You've just suppressed them. All right. And what happens is, and when we raise our boys not to emote, not to express emotion, not to express I feel incompetent, I feel inadequate. You know, I'm in 6th grade on 4th grade reading level. That bothers me. Right. I'm in 11th grade. No girls talk to me. Or I'm in 9th grade and I don't know what my sexuality is. And I can't even go to church to talk about it because I'm going to be judged. Right. When those feelings are there and boys don't talk about them, guess what happens? They metastasize just like cancer. So they go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4. All right. And we're not only seeing that in boys, we're seeing that in girls. Savage. I'm savage. I don't have any feelings. I don't care about your feelings. Right. And so when we're teaching our kids that the best way to survive is to go numb, that's their only defense mechanism. We're actually making them sicker. And that's why we've seen in the pandemic a significant spike in anxiety, depression, and unfortunately, suicide attempts because kids don't talk. They don't express emotion. And if we can just get them to do that, just express how they feel, we can diffuse that emotion and take it from a 10 down to a 7, down to a... There's nothing magical about counseling. Right? Psychologists don't like this study, but they show that if you talk to a psychologist, a social worker, a grandma, or a stranger, if they all listen the same way, kids feel heard and seen. All right. Now, I'm not talking about the high level bipolar, schizophrenia, and stuff like that, real high level anxiety disorder. But if we could just get kids to feel heard, by an adult or a friend who cares about them, that carries their emotions and feels them. So kids want to be felt. You don't have to agree with me, but do you feel me?
Mhm.
And if you feel me, then we can have kids feel loved.
And Dr. Perry,
I
you
think it's
talked about
important.
a little bit of the social media aspect of it. And we think, I certainly think what I have experienced with some of the young people I work with is they've mastered social media, but they lack social skills. And they have
So
been underdeveloped in the social skills and graces that allow for them at times to actually know how to diffuse things, to walk back from the things that they are feeling. So as an educator, when you're in that space, what are you noticing about the lack of development around the social skill and graces that our children have, because they are so embedded with their social media content as opposed to the human contact?
yeah, I'm gonna. One of the common themes that we see in all the school shooters
Mm-hmm.
is they were disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't belong to any clubs or churches, mosques or synagogues. They weren't part of any groups at all. In fact, they, for all intents and purposes, didn't feel like they mattered. And while everyone who feels so disconnected doesn't turn into a school shooter,
Mm-hmm.
there are those people who are the most susceptible to becoming violent towards themselves and or others. So one of the things that we do in our schools is we understand that we have to push the affective side of the house, which means that we want children to be as involved in as many activities as possible. This is how you as parents and educators can begin to stem the tide. We'll get to the social media part of it in a minute. Just practically speaking, what we see among those people who we find who are happiest is that they are the most engaged. So the children who have dance in the fall, uh, 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 piano in the winter, and basketball, track in the spring. They have activities with their church or mosque or synagogue or arts group or whatever. They are programmed around their interests. And what happens in that space is they find people with like interests and allows them to engage and feel heard and seen at their best. One of the things I encourage our colleagues to do sometimes is that kid, that boy who keeps acting up in class, go watch him in basketball practice. I bet you ain't acting up there. I bet you he's acting just like he's supposed to act. And you're gonna go to that coach who doesn't have a degree, doesn't have a certification, and say, how'd you get Jaquan to stand still? Jaquan doesn't normally stand still. He only stands still for me because he's in a space where he can be seen, heard, felt, and engaged. He's also with other people who are like him. He's found his tribe. So as many of the people, and when you look for colleges, they call it fit. When you look for the fit on campus. So we want to engage children on multiple levels. We want to engage them after school in those times. And then throughout the day, we have something called advisory, where every single child is part of an advisory. And that advisory does, at the beginning of it, a check-in. A check-in. None of these kids are social workers, psychologists, or scientists. They're 17. They don't even know entirely how babies are formed. So we're not asking them to do any high-level mental health things. But what they are doing is they're going around the room and saying, Dr. King, how you feeling today? Dr. Tar, how you feeling today? Ms. Gay, how you feeling today? And everyone goes around, well, you know, this or this, or this, or whatever, but they're using their language to communicate their emotions before they become something that nobody can fix. They're in a safe space where they're engaging and they're using the kind of language that's necessary. Those children and adults who end up engaging in some of those really reprehensible violent actions, their primary method of social engagement is social media, which is the least social of all communication, because at its core, it begins with an aesthetic that isn't real. You can put up a meme that isn't you. You can hide behind a name that isn't even your birth name. People who know you don't even know that you're Honeybee Iced Tea. They don't know anything about you, and They wouldn't recognize the persona that you put on when you're in that space because there's no accountability. So those people who we find who are the most anti-social are the ones who are most socially media engaged. Anti-social and social media, because in both cases, they don't actually deal with people. The ones who are the most socialized are the ones who participate in clubs, sports, and activities. The ones who go to the cookout, who sit and talk. There are things that we say about the way we were raised that we shouldn't use anymore, but there are other things that we taught do work. You need to speak when you see somebody. When you see somebody, you need to say hello. When your mother comes in the house, you need to get up and greet her at the front door. When your grandmother goes out, when grandmother's coming up, she got groceries, you bring your little black behind out there and go get these groceries. Those humility, those engagement, that socialization, helps you to feel like you're part of something. And it also helps you to understand your role in this. You are a child. Doesn't mean you don't have an opinion, but it means that I have expertise. So your opinion carries for a little while until somebody needs to make the call, and then that's on me. Yeah. And you get to feel safe knowing that I'm going to get to do that more often. The point is that social media typically occurs when a child is left alone and raised by a cell phone. And that creates an antisocial individual. An antisocial individual. And don't think about them as just children. Today, we had a professional development at our schools, and I led it. And I began by saying, all right, push your computers down. Everybody. I'm here. Y'all don't need to be talking to nobody else. This guy. Down, 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 down. All right, now we're going to get down to business. We don't even recognize it as adults. There are times when people who love us are talking to us, and we're like this. The brain doesn't work that way, ladies and gentlemen. The brain actually doesn't work that way. It doesn't multitask. It either is paying attention or it isn't paying attention.
That's right.
That's why you can't drive and text. I just promised my sons that I would stop driving and texting because you can't do both. You will die. So to your question about social media is what many people who are on the verge of becoming antisocial use as the safest place. Final point is one of my sons was showing me something about it's like a meta world where you actually can go in and create your, like VR, virtual reality glasses. And I watched this and I was in rapture because I was thinking, they're not even real people. Like they're not even real people. And they're driving a car and the car crashes into someone, not like Grand Theft Auto, like they're really doing it. And there's no accountability. There's no one to say, your grandmother's outside. And I heard her pull up. And I know that she's got something in the car that's hot because we're having a cookout. So you need to be moving on that. When children are left alone, the book was called Lord of the Flies. It doesn't go well. They don't have a rudder. They don't have a compass. There's no one saying, all right, ladies and gentlemen, enough. All right, y'all did it enough. Move on to the next thing. Move on to the next. No structure, no engagement. Listen, children are like rose bushes. Unpruned, they're just pricker bushes that occasionally have flowers. Pruned, they're magnificent.
When we look at prison, how do you punish criminals? If I get in a fight, what happens? I go to solitary confinement, which we have been shown is psychologically damaging. It's there's no data that goes against that, right? And so with our kids are being isolated on social media, right? They're being asocial, right? But here's the warning. If you have a teen girl, her self-esteem is lower if she has social media, right? Because she's comparing herself to these beauty ideals, and you see the average teen that does not like herself and can't post pictures without the right angle, the right filter, the right Snapchat, whatever it is. And so we know that social media has actually, and the social media companies admit this, all right, that it actually lowers the self-esteem of teen girls. Here's a dilemma. That's how they communicate. So you have to actually make them come together. How many teen girls do you see come in the same room and they communicate with their phones while actively ignoring one another? These
Yeah.
things are addictive. Dr. Perry talks about it. I have to turn my phone all over, right? To not look at ESPN 6 times. Nothing happened in 8 minutes, but I'm still looking at it. So the point is this. We have to usher our kids into connecting with other people. That's a form of emotional connection. And restore family dinner. Restore
Yes.
the check-in. Dr. Perry talked
Yes.
about starting with the thumbs up, okay and down. I would add motivational interview. Ask your kids this on a scale of 1 to 10. How happy are you with life right now? Watch what they say. 3, 2, 1, 4, 7. Now they're gonna be smiling. Or you think they're doing well, but once they start opening up about that number, that's your entry point as a parent, as a counselor, as a principal, as a community, leader, to say, why are you at a 4? And then when you start listening to our kids, then we can stop the acting out behavior really quickly. As a psychologist, what happens? All right, they get suspended from Dr. Perry's school. They call a psychologist to get back in. I ask them, what's going on in your life? They talk about all these traumas, right? Then the kid calms down and goes back to school. But what if we dealt with the traumas before they act out? Like Dr. Perry said, when they come in, and Kip does this as well. There are a number of schools, and Dr. King talked about it. It's 2 goals of education: academic and character development. We've thrown the character development out the door, right? And so we have to get our kids we have to do check-ins proactively to get them to see it's the norm to talk about how they feel so that they can be well.
But Dr. King, I want for you to be able to just jump in because I know our time is winding up, and this has been a phenomenal conversation, and certainly we could go on and on. But I wanted to be able to be able to amplify, because a lot of times you hear this critique. Where are we showing up with this violence that is happening with our children? We are quiet when those things happen with our own children. But if there's a police involved shooting, and we certainly have had these conversations, then everybody's ready to march, to shout. But I think it's important, because we are even having this conversation tonight, to talk about the importance of there might not be the amplification in the same way in communities that people like yourself, Dr. Perry, Dr. Tart, are committed to doing this work when it comes to the violence in our communities. And we're not just sitting and waiting to have an opportunity to march when it is related to shooting. So I just wanted to have you have an opportunity to talk about why this work is so important for the King Center as well, that it is not something we rest on our laurels and say we only take on these things when they happen based on people we believe are outside of our community having these effects on us. But we are also invested in ensuring that these things and these types of conversations tonight are happening, so we are able to prevent more of these things from happening in our communities.
Yeah, I think the reality is there's a lot going on that many of us don't know about. I was listening to that, looking at that question that you mentioned when you first asked me the question about why are people silent in our daily shootings, but they're much louder when we talk about cop killings. Well, that's not necessarily true. That's what gets the attention. For instance, my son, General, in New York, is doing a wonderful campaign now called Boycott Black Murder. And, it is not getting right now, it's not getting the kind of attention that it should get. And he's talking about it holistically, not just cops, but what's happening, what we're doing to each other in our communities. And so people are doing the work. We're doing it all the time. We just don't publicize, because I think the most important thing is to do the work. Is to have the conversations that we're having tonight, chop these conversations up and represent them to the public, so people can begin to do what needs to be done. But what I want to say more importantly is, as we get ready to close, because I need to say this, I want to thank these 2 gentlemen, because this conversation is a much needed conversation. You all have have poured out your hearts tonight, not just talking from your head, even though Dr. Tart, I know you're the expert. But I appreciate the way you all have broken this conversation down tonight for so many people. And the thing that touched my heart the most is the amplification of how important it is for us to be connected and stay connected and to touch and feel our children. That is what I was saying earlier. There's a cry out there, and even with those, Dr. Perry, that you're saying are not saying the right things to their kids, they need to be touched. Unfortunately, violence begets violence generationally, and we have to be responsible for disrupting that, and we have to be accountable to these other adults and take responsibility. We got to step to some of these sisters in a loving way, and even brothers to the other brothers, and teach them another way, because they can't come out of it themselves. They don't know anything else but what you were saying. And so we have to fill in all of those gaps. It's the village effect that we have to continue if we're going to turn this thing around. But tonight really has been about, how do we connect with the next generation? How do we make sure we can begin to disrupt the cycle of violence in our society? And it starts with each and every one of us in the spaces where we are, and in touching the lives of the young people that we're involved in, and being conscious. What Dr. Perry said is so important. Let's all be conscious of that. When we're talking, we need to check what we're saying, because sometimes in a joking way, we might be saying the wrong thing and in feeding the wrong thing. And so next time you open your mouth to say something, just I had a mentor early on that said, be sure brain is engaged before putting mouth into gear. And so we need to do a lot of that checking as well with what we are saying out of our mouths, because it is important that we all be human. The gender differences around who should be touchy-feely versus not, that needs to go out. That needs to go away. We all need to be touched. We're emotional human beings, and we need to connect with each other and stay connected. And that's what I was saying early on in my experience. I was dangerously close to becoming a dangerous person. Let me just say that. And I had to have some help along the way, because the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. would have been probably behind bars or maybe even dead, who knows, if I had not had any kind of intervention in the kind of community around me in my pain, because I felt very isolated and disconnected for so many years. And so, if you're out there tonight, that hug, thank you, that hug can change a lot of stuff. A hug, literally, and this might sound simplistic, foolish, crazy to most people, but a hug started me on a journey to not hating white people anymore, because I went through a phase where I hated white people, especially white men. And it was a white man who hugged me in a moment where I was talking about the pain of not having my father, that made the difference. So if nothing else, hug your kids tonight and keep your ears open to them constantly, and make sure your language is appropriate.
Well, I just say I have certainly been so excited about being able to be in the space with you all, with all of the great things that we have shared this evening, what you all have shared, the vulnerability that you have opened up with Dr. King this evening, and being able to be open and honest and vulnerable with our audience tonight. I want to thank each of you all, Dr. Tart and Dr. Perry, for being here. We had no doubt when the invitations were extended that we would have phenomenal conversation this evening. And certainly you all have not done anything but the very best of deliverance on being great conversationalists tonight. So I want to just thank everyone for being here this evening. And as we close out for tonight, I just also want to acknowledge once again that this conversation is certainly not something that requires that you have a PhD to be able to have. You don't have to have any letters in front or behind your name to engage in conversation. And so we will invite you all again at the close of this session tonight. If you didn't get a chance to get the barcode to register to host a courageous conversation, we will run it again for you all to be able to have an opportunity to do so. We thank you all so much for being here this evening. As the new school year begins for so many families across the nation, we ask that, again, in the simplest of ways, touch each other, touch in with each other, check in with each other. When you have the capacity to seek help for your children or for yourselves on this journey to mental wellness, we encourage you to do so. If finances are sometimes the challenge, reach out to other organizations that are also out there, because there are a number of institutions who now recognize the crisis that we are in related to mental health, especially with our children related to violence. And so we certainly encourage you all to find the resources that you all need. We thank you so much for being here with us in this conversation this evening. We hope that there are some takeaways for not only those that are parents, those who are like Dr. King and myself who make up great aunts, or those who are just persons who work with children in the space of education. Pay attention to them, ask them to pay attention to themselves, and we wish you all a safe school year, and thank you all once again. We'll see you here again for another Beloved Community Talks. Good night.
The future belongs to those who show up, to those who come together and continue the good work of building the beloved community. Over the past few years, we've witnessed an awakening, one filled with shock and anger, alongside fear, pain, and exhaustion. We've seen bold claims and commitments and new voices stepping up. Change is happening. But with change comes resistance. Ushering in a new way of living, one free from racial division, requires rigorous persistence, nonviolent persistence. A love-centered way of thinking, acting, speaking, and engaging that leads to individual and societal transformation. What better way to build the beloved community than by bringing people together over food and conversation? In partnership with Inclusive, formerly known as Civic Dinners, the King Center is inviting you to host a beloved community dinner and continue the work of bridging the racial divide. Are you in? Here's how to get involved. Sign up to host a beloved community dinner. You'll receive the host guide with the 3 big questions. You can invite your neighbors, peers, colleagues, family, and friends to join. And you can host at your home or at your favorite restaurant or online. Simply follow the host guide for an amazing conversation and experience the power of community. You'll walk away feeling refueled and inspired with new ideas, connections, and resources. In times of isolation and exhaustion, simply coming together in community can make all the difference. Together we can build the beloved community. Join us.